The sound was swallowed by fog. It came at dawn on the 17th of March, 1804, one crack of musket fire that echoed through the fields of Vincennes and across the conscience of Europe. The man who fell was not a traitor, not even a soldier of war, but a prince, Louis-Antoine Henri de Bourbon, Duke of Enghien, heir to a vanished throne. He died standing in a trench, his boots sinking into wet earth, his name already condemned by order of Napoleon Bonaparte. The night before, the Duke had been dragged from a castle in Baden, accused of conspiring against the first consul. No evidence was ever found, only fear. Napoleon, newly crowned by victory and paranoia alike, needed a ghost to silence the living. The Duke became that ghost. In Paris, the order moved faster than mercy. 12 officers convened in the dark, their tribunal held between midnight and guilt. The verdict was written before the candles burned out. When dawn came, guards led the Duke through the corridors of the fortress, his hands bound but his posture unbroken. He refused a blindfold. He said only, "I have long wished to die for my country. I only regret dying for no cause." The ditch had been dug hours earlier, shallow and waiting. The soldiers hesitated. No one wanted to fire. But duty is louder than conscience. The volley struck. The Duke fell backward into the mud. The earth received him quietly, as if unwilling to take part. When word reached Paris, silence fell upon the salons. Even Bonaparte's allies spoke in whispers. The act had been legal, perhaps, but not forgivable. The monarchs of Europe trembled, not for the Duke, but for the idea that no title, no birthright could shield a man from the ambition of another. Later that day, the grave was filled in, quick and plain. No marker, no prayer, only a handful of limes scattered across the stain where royalty had become clay. Napoleon had killed more men on battlefields, but this one death would outlive all his victories. A shot in a ditch, yet it echoed through history like a bell rung for empire's soul. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, reverberating through every story of power that mistook fear for justice. Long before the musket cracked at Vincennes, the hunt had begun. France in 1804 was a country haunted by ghosts, royalists hiding in cellars, spies whispering through taverns, priests saying mass behind locked doors. The revolution had promised freedom but delivered suspicion. Every whisper of conspiracy was a mirror held up to Napoleon's fear that history might repeat itself. The Duke of Enghien, exiled in the small German state of Baden, was hardly a threat. He lived quietly, gambling, hunting, and pacing through borrowed estates with the melancholy of a man who had outlived his purpose. Yet his bloodline, Bourbon, was enough to poison Bonaparte's sleep. To the first consul, lineage itself was an accusation. Rumors reached Paris that royalists plotted to restore the monarchy, that assassins were paid in English gold, that a Bourbon prince waited across the Rhine to lead them. None of it was proved. But in Napoleon's mind, doubt was treason, and treason required a sacrifice. On March 10th, under cover of darkness, French dragoons crossed the frontier in violation of every treaty. They rode hard through the forests of Ettenheim until they reached the small chateau where the Duke slept. The arrest was brutal and absurd, like history tearing a page from the wrong chapter. Windows shattered, doors splintered, and the prince woke to find muskets aimed at his chest. He demanded to see the warrant. There was none. The captain simply replied, "Our orders come from Paris." They bound the Duke and dragged him away before dawn, leaving behind a bed still warm and a dog that would not stop howling. The journey to France was long, mud-slick, and silent. At every village, the soldiers avoided questions, pretending they carried a deserter. The Duke asked for pen and ink, but was refused. He spoke little, only to say that France had forgotten its own laws. When they reached the fortress of Vincennes, rain began to fall. Steady, cleansing, indifferent. Napoleon received the news that evening while dining at the Tuileries. He said nothing at first, then rose and walked to the window. Outside, the city was quiet, its lamps trembling in the wind. Finally, he murmured, "A Bourbon must die." It was less an order than a prophecy he could no longer control. The ghost he hunted was not the Duke of Enghien. It was the old world he could never escape, the crown he had stolen still burning against his brow. The Château de Vincennes had once been a royal residence, a place where kings hunted in the surrounding woods and courtiers debated love and loyalty beneath painted ceilings. By 1804, those chambers had turned to stone and silence. The same walls that once echoed with music now carried the smell of damp straw and gun oil. When the Duke of Enghien arrived, chained and mud-streaked, the guards did not bow. They only opened the gates and let history close behind him. He was led down a corridor so narrow that his shoulders brushed both sides. Torches hissed in iron brackets, throwing trembling halos on the walls. At the far end waited the commandant, General Hulin, uneasy in his new authority. The Duke saluted. Even in arrest, etiquette survived, and asked for paper to write a letter to the first consul. Hulin hesitated, then granted it, knowing the appeal would never reach Paris. The note, written in precise hand, ended with the words, "I die innocent. Let my blood fall only on the man who condemns me." That letter was intercepted, sealed, and filed away in the archives where dust would become its only witness. The interrogation began immediately. 12 officers, some drunk with fear, questioned him through the night. They demanded confessions he did not possess, lists of names, plots that never existed. The Duke answered calmly, his dignity a kind of weapon. At one point he laughed softly and said, "Gentlemen, you interrogate a ghost." No one replied. Outside, the fortress slept beneath rain that refused to stop. Guards smoked by the gate, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. Everyone sensed that something irreversible was approaching, as if the air itself had chosen sides. At 3 a.m., word arrived from Paris. Proceed without delay. The tribunal reconvened, exhausted and ashamed. No defense was heard, no witnesses called. The verdict, death by musket, was signed by men whose hands shook so hard the ink bled. Hulin read it aloud in a voice that broke halfway through. The Duke stood, nodded once, and asked for a priest. None could be found. The city's clergy had fled years earlier. "Then God will understand," he said. He refused food, refused rest, and sat beside the barred window watching dawn seep into the courtyard like diluted blood. Somewhere beyond the walls, birds began to sing, the first sound of morning, and the last he would ever hear. In those final hours, even his captors began to whisper prayers. The silence grew heavier than chains, and every man in that prison understood that they were not merely holding a prisoner. They were holding their own judgment. When the sun reached the towers of Vincennes, the order was given. The ditch had been dug. History was ready. Dawn at Vincennes came gray and reluctant, the kind of light that makes every shape seem guilty. Mist curled above the moat like breath from something buried. The Duke of Enghien stood in the courtyard surrounded by soldiers who could not meet his gaze. They had been awake all night, waiting for an order they prayed might be rescinded. It never was. He wore a simple blue coat, the same he had slept in since his arrest. His hair was tied neatly. He had asked for no favors, no audience, only that his last words be heard by the officer who would give the command. The officer, a young colonel whose hands trembled, agreed, but could not promise to remember them. The firing party lined up along the trench wall freshly cut in the wet earth. The ditch was narrow, filling with the slow trickle of rainwater. The Duke looked down at it and said quietly, "It will be a short sleep." Then he removed his cravat and handed it to a sergeant, asking that it be sent to his fiancée, Charlotte de Rohan. No one dared move. The gesture was too human for the morning's purpose. A drumbeat began, soft, uncertain. The Duke refused the blindfold. He stood straight, facing the muzzles, his breath visible in the cold. For a moment, even the wind held its breath. The officer raised his sword. The volley cracked once, a flash, a smell of powder, a sound that vanished into fog. The Duke fell backward into the ditch as though the earth itself had claimed him. His hat rolled to the side. A thin thread of smoke drifted from the muskets. No one spoke. The soldiers lowered their weapons and waited for an echo that did not come. General Hulin removed his hat. He tried to say the customary words, "May God receive his soul," but his voice failed. One of the guards, unable to bear the silence, whispered, "He died like a soldier." Another replied, "No, like a prince." The body was covered with a cloak and left where it had fallen. A gravedigger shoveled dirt into the trench until the blue coat disappeared beneath the mud. By the time the sun rose, there was no sign a man had stood there at all. In Paris, Napoleon read the report without expression. "It is done," he said simply, and walked away. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame rang for morning mass, their sound carried east by the same wind that crossed Vincennes. Somewhere between those two places, the altar and the ditch, Europe's faith in justice faltered. The Duke's death was swift, but its echo outlived empires. One shot, one body, and a silence that history has never been able to fill. The news traveled faster than the March wind. By the time the first crocuses bloomed in Vienna and London, every salon in Europe whispered the same sentence. The Duke of Enghien is dead, shot without trial. It passed from embassy to drawing room, from candlelit dinners to pulpits. The reaction was not merely grief, but disbelief, as if the old rules of civilization had been executed with him. In the courts of Europe, silence replaced diplomacy. The Tsar of Russia called the act a murder cloaked in legality. The King of Prussia refused to send congratulations for Napoleon's new title as emperor. Even the Pope turned away envoys from Paris. Monarchs, who had once feared Bonaparte, now loathed him, for he had proven that their crowns could be broken by a single man with no crown at all. In London, the papers printed engravings of the Duke kneeling before a firing squad, some imagined, some cruelly accurate. The public devoured them like communion, every copy sold within hours. Pamphlets named Napoleon not hero, but butcher of Vincennes. Children played at soldiers, pretending to condemn invisible kings. The act had turned Europe's appetite for glory into nausea. Inside France, however, the mood was stranger. Many pretended to approve, whispering that it was necessary to show strength. But in the cafes and corridors, the air trembled with a new kind of fear. The realization that no one was safe, not even those who served closest to the throne. Generals polished their epaulets as though guilt could be removed with brass. Ministers walked carefully, avoiding the word Enghien as if it were contagious. Napoleon himself defended the deed before the Senate. "What is a Bourbon prince compared to the peace of France?" he demanded. The chamber applauded, though the echo was thin. He left the podium believing he had silenced the world, not hearing that silence is the prelude to memory. Across Europe, poets began to write elegies for the young Duke, verses printed in secret, carried in pockets like relics. They called him the martyr of the ditch, the last noble of France. Painters depicted his ghost standing over the fortress of Vincennes, eyes open, accusing. The image would outlive every portrait of the man who ordered his death. Even years later, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor beneath the vaults of Notre Dame, the whisper returned. Courtiers bowed but did not forget. The crown glittered, but beneath it lay the shadow of a grave without a name. No empire can thrive on a crime it refuses to acknowledge. And from that morning onward, Napoleon's victories carried a hidden cost. The sound of a single gunshot following behind them like a conscience that refused to stay buried. In the years that followed, Napoleon's empire spread like a tide swallowing the continent. Yet wherever his armies marched, across Italy, Austria, Spain, one rumor marched with them: Vincennes. Soldiers heard it in the taverns of Milan, whispered it while sharpening bayonets before battle. It was not strategy or courage they doubted. It was the silence of their emperor when confronted with ghosts. Whenever the name of the Duke surfaced, Napoleon stiffened as if struck. His eyes narrowed, his voice lowered to a whisper that could slice marble. Enough. he would say. It was justice. But the word hung heavy, unconvincing. Even his marshals, men who had followed him through cannon fire, avoided the subject. They knew that beneath his brilliance lay a wound he could neither justify nor close. Privately, he tried to rewrite the narrative. Letters were forged, testimonies edited, archives rearranged. Official bulletins declared the Duke guilty of plots with England, an accusation no historian has ever proved. The Emperor built monuments to his triumphs, but none to his doubts. Yet every time he saw the color blue, the hue of the Duke's coat, something flickered across his face, something dangerously close to regret.
Josephine once asked him gently if he ever thought of the man in the ditch. He replied, "I think of France." She said nothing more. After their divorce, she told friends that his greatest fear was not assassination, but memory. In portraits painted during his reign, the artist's brush could never quite soften his expression. There is pride, yes, but behind it a shadow around the mouth, as though a single name is caught between his teeth. Enghien.
Foreign diplomats never stopped reminding him. The Tsar mentioned it at Tilsit. British cartoonists printed it in every satire. Even as his victories piled higher, that one death refused to lie down. It followed him through coronations and treaties, through the snows of Russia and the smoke of Waterloo. The ditch at Vincennes became a metaphor whispered by his enemies and worshippers alike, that the man who conquered kingdoms could not conquer remorse. In exile on St. Helena, he spoke of it only once. The island's wind carried his words to the secretary recording his memoirs. Was it an error? Napoleon asked aloud, then answered himself, perhaps. But errors are what make men great. He paused, staring at the horizon where the sea met nothing. Still, he said after a long silence, I wish it had been otherwise. History rarely grants its architects the mercy of forgetting. For every victory column he left behind, there remained a trench at Vincennes, unmarked, unhealed, whispering through time that even emperors must answer to the dead. 2 centuries later, the morning fog still clings to the walls of Vincennes. The fortress has become a museum now, its courtyards quiet, its cells curated. Tourists walk where soldiers once stood, reading plaques that summarize agony in tidy paragraphs. Few linger near the trench behind the old rampart. There the grass grows too green, as if nourished by memory. The ditch where the Duke of Enghien fell was rediscovered during renovations in the mid-19th century. Workmen unearthed fragments of bone, a tarnished buckle, and the rusted outline of musket balls fused together by moisture and time. Among them lay a small golden locket containing a lock of hair. On its rim, the faint engraving, L.A.H. de Bourbon. The remains were reburied in a marble crypt, the name finally restored. But stone cannot erase what the earth has already recorded.
Historians would later call Vincennes Napoleon's original sin. It was not his greatest massacre, nor his bloodiest decision, but it was the most intimate. One man's fear executed upon another man's honor. The act turned triumph into tragedy, revealing that beneath every empire's banners lies a single grave dug too soon.
Even in our time, when you stand at the site and the wind sweeps through the trees, you can hear the muffled echo of that volley, soft as a sigh. It is not the sound of death, but of consequence, the reminder that power always writes its own indictment. Napoleon's empire crumbled, his statues toppled, his name passed through centuries of adoration and condemnation. Yet the Duke of Enghien, forgotten in life, endured in death. His story survived through diaries, poems, and the stubborn persistence of guilt. Every retelling reopens the ditch just long enough for the world to look in again. The irony is cruel. Napoleon's ambition sought immortality, but it was the life he took that secured it. The emperor became legend, the duke, conscience. Together they built a parable no nation can escape, of brilliance undone by fear, and of justice betrayed by haste. Standing at Vincennes today, beneath skies the color of lead, one understands that history is not a line, but a circle. The same questions return. How much must be sacrificed for order? How far may a ruler go before he becomes the thing he claims to destroy? The ditch does not answer. It only waits, patient as the past. So when you walk away, remember that behind every victory march there lies a place like this, quiet, unmarked, and watching. Because every empire, in the end, must kneel beside its own ditch. And if this story has followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Leave a thought for the ones buried not by enemies, but by history itself. Some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they hurt.